Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported, independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire. And please help me build up the YouTube channel by subscribing, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Today, we welcome Dr. George Szamuely. George and I talked about the strengthening alliance between Russia and China, the shock and concern expressed by U.S. officials after recent meetings and comments by the Chinese and Russian leaders, and about the American policy decisions and imperial adventures over the last few decades that made that convergence inevitable. We discussed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Zbigniew Brzezinski, former Ambassador McFaul, and the long history of opposition to detente with Russia by factions of the U.S. national security state and NATO. Then we talked about how all of this relates to Russiagate, as well as recent developments in that arena. George also shared some of his expertise on Yugoslavia, and we plan to follow up on that topic in more depth in the future. George Szamuely is the author of the book Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia, and he's a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. We recorded this on June 15th, 2019. Dr. George Szamuely is here with us, speaking to us from Hungary. Welcome to Around the Empire, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much, Joanne, for inviting me.
So the thing that sparked this conversation is that the other day, Brett McGurk, and for people who don't know who Brett McGurk is, he was the, he was the special envoy, President Obama. He was appointed as the special presidential envoy for global coalition to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. In other words, ISIS. No wonder I couldn't remember that. And he quit December 31st, 2018. So he's no longer in that position. But he's very active on Twitter. And here's what he said. It was a thread. The first one says, China's President Xi completes a historic 3-day visit to Moscow and hails strategic ties with Putin. 2, China and Russian military commands meet to discuss deepening strategic partnerships. And then the last one is, today, both Putin and Xi met with the Iranian President Rouhani and expressed their full support for Iran, even in the wake of smoking tankers and U.S. evidence that Iran was unquestionably behind the attack. This trend threatens to reverse a signal achievement of the Cold War and runs totally contrary to Trump's own national security strategy, with emphasis on great power competition and needlessly avoiding Chinese-Russian convergence. And so George responded to that. He said, this simply isn't true. There's nothing, not one word in that national security strategy on what steps the U.S. would take to halt the Russia-China convergence. It's a bit late in the day for pretending that you were ever interested in pursuing Nixon realpolitik. And then I responded to George and said, McGurk is playing a blame game here. He's been embedded in the last 3 administrations, all of whom made the Russia and China alliance inevitable, especially Obama. For years, I've heard and read scholars saying that moving into Ukraine would be the last straw, would push Russia into China's arms. Obama administration didn't listen. So that's what started this. And George, I'm really interested in hearing more of your thoughts on this convergence, if we call it alliance, because it's been a major topic, of course. The infamous Zbigniew Brzezinski global chessboard book, talked all about this and avoiding this. And, it's been this thing that for so long we've been trying to avoid. And yet, from my perspective, our war and foreign policy was encouraging it, was making it happen. It was just completely contradictory to this supposed goal of preventing that kind of strong alliance.
Yes, this is exactly the case. If we go right back to the end of the Cold War and the sudden collapse of the USSR, how did the United States respond? The United States responded by immediately scooping up the former allies of the Soviet Union, all of the Eastern European states that had been members of the Warsaw Pact, and even states that were actually component parts of the USSR, such as the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, scooping them up within NATO, an alliance that is clearly directed against Russia. Now, this was obviously not calculated to win Russian friendship. And then if one thinks of, as this NATO expansion continued, and then they scooped up even non-Warsaw Pact member states, such as the former republics of Yugoslavia, which of course had not been part of the Warsaw Pact. As this continued, to the point in which almost every country in Europe, from west to east, every country from Portugal right up to the Russian border was part of NATO. This was bound to cause some level of anxiety.
Yeah.
And when in 2008, George W. Bush tried to rope in Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, I mean, this was actually made. There was a declaration, a NATO declaration, I think it was in the Bucharest summit in 2008, that Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO. Now, this is a very, very serious business. I mean, Ukraine and Russia are really brother countries. I mean, they are so close historically, culturally, linguistically. I mean, that's a serious business. I mean, it would be like, I don't know, Russia roping in Canada as a military ally. The United States wouldn't just sit still for that, and yet Russia was expected to sit still. So, when you look at what they did towards Russia, and then when you think of what the Obama administration, with its famous pivot towards Asia, which was calculated to thwart the rise of China, and then you combine that with, of course, Trump's attempt to deal with China's economy through his tariff war. This is bound to push Russia and China together. And this has been a long-term thing. I mean, now Russia and China are strategic allies. I mean, if one thinks of the most recent visit of the Chinese president to Russia, this was a 3-day visit, a very, very big deal. He said, Putin is my best friend. This is it. We are now strategic allies. Now, the Chinese don't just throw these words around. That's a serious thing. I mean, when they say something like that, he's my best friend, we are strategic allies. That means there really is very much a new alliance that's going to be shaping world politics. So going back to Brett McGurk, for McGurk to suggest that, oh, well, there is this Russian-Chinese convergence, and that United States, is in some sort of a position to bring this to an end, it's just absolutely delusional. This convergence has been going on for 25 years at least, and now, Russia and China are inseparable. And so people like McGurk, who pretend that, we can somehow go back to the kind of the Nixon era, are again, as doing what U.S. policymakers often do, fooling the American public about the extent to which the world has changed, and not in a way that's favorable to the United States.
Right. And, is this another case of American foreign policy experts or policymakers being ignorant about other cultures and other countries? Did we, like, I've heard people say, oh, that'll never happen. Mm-hmm. Russia and China hate each other. They don't trust each other. They have a long history, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Do you think that that's the case? Or do you think that, there's just an obsession? This is my view, kind of. It's just this sort of obsession with Russia among some factions of our foreign policy establishment who like can't even seem to help themselves.
Right.
Um, like, well, how do you think this came about? Or I know that's probably not a simple question to answer.
Well, the United States at the end of the Cold War didn't really feel the need to build alliances as it did during the Cold War. So when Nixon and Kissinger made their kind of tilt towards China, that was that was with the view of the world in the 1970s. The world in the 1970s was one in which the USSR had reached um, military parity with the United States. I mean, it was now equal to the United States, and so so the Nixon and Kissinger really needed some ally to tilt the global balance of power towards the United States, and so that's why they kind of cultivated China as a kind of potential ally, and that was their famous kind of balance of power politics. But that was then. I mean, when the Cold War came to an end, it seemed like the USSR was that's it, it's gone, not a player anymore. And the United States went rushed to, as I said, rushed to ensure that with the United States, Russia would never be a player anymore. In other words, push it right into the Far East, almost into sort of Asian territory. And so therefore, the Americans didn't really feel the need to play balance of power politics. And as you say, there was also a lot of smugness involved. And the smugness when you said, oh, Russia and China hate each other, they're deadly enemies, this friendship will never last. That is just absolute smugness and complacency. Because you can say this about other countries. I mean, England and France were rivals for many centuries, fought innumerable number of wars against each other, but are now inseparable. Even the United States and Great Britain were rivals and quite hostile to each other for a long time before they became inseparable as they are now, particularly after World War II. So there's nothing unusual about countries putting aside their differences and becoming firm and fast friends. There is now nothing at all that is dividing Russia and China. There's nothing. There's no territorial dispute. There's no economic dispute. No cultural dispute. There's no dispute. They are both united in one overarching goal, which is they want to prevent U.S. hegemony in the world, and that's what their alliance is directed towards, and that's their major priority. And all the rest, whatever historic territorial disputes that Americans can sort of dig up, are of no importance whatsoever.
It really does look like they are the anti-empire forces. Mm-hmm. I've talked to someone in Russia who said that's the wrong way to look at it. It's really a defensive stance. Mm-hmm. So I take that I take that into consideration too. I think that's probably what triggered it. But I can remember different times when China would complain. They'd say, we need a more fair. The institutions, the large institutions, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and things like this, they were just complaining that they couldn't get fair treatment. What they felt they couldn't get fair treatment. And from the things I saw, it looked to me like it was probably a valid complaint. And in the last, I don't know, let's say decade, maybe since the Iraq War, maybe that was that changed everything. I'm not quite sure. It just seems like as we saw these rising powers, the empire became, and not just the American empire, the Anglo-American Empire, the European American Empire, whatever you want to call it, recognized that there was an inevitable decline, and that we weren't going to be a sole superpower anymore. And even though it seemed to me, and people said back in the 90s, that this sole superpower situation was not sustainable for that long a time, but it would go on for at least a decade. And there were a lot of people who wanted to take advantage of that. For example, Paul Wolfowitz made these statements to Wesley Clark, that He said, we've got a decade or so, and, we have to go and go. He talked about overthrowing what he called the Soviet client states in the Middle East.
And I realized then it came back to me. A 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. In 2001 he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991 he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position in the Pentagon. And I had gone to see him when I was a one-star general. I was commanding the National Training Center. I had met him one time. He said, if you ever get to Washington, come look me up. They always say that. Well, I was there in Washington. It was a Friday afternoon. I'd visited Colin Powell. He'd given me 5 minutes of his precious time and sent me on my way, and I was bored in the Pentagon, and I thought, I'll just go, who can I see? I think I'll see Wolfowitz. So I called, and up there, he was available. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in, and I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm. And he said, well, yeah, he said, but not really. He said, because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't. And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of 91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, but one thing we did learn, he said, we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us. He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes, Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. And it was like, I'm coming out of the Mojave Desert. I've been training troops. I haven't been thinking geostrategy for some time. And suddenly a guy just sort of shoves this nugget at you. Well, you remember it. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991.
So clearly they were thinking that this superpower situation wasn't going to be forever. But as the time approached, to relent, to recognize, and to just accept the fact that there was going to be a multi-polar world again, there are certain factions here that don't seem to want to give that up. And this looks to me like a declining empire, just unwilling to give up that power. And that is the thing that Russia and China, I guess they tried through other means to, get changes made to different global institutions, and unsuccessfully. And now they seem to want to create some replacement institutions. For example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Is that what just the meeting that just happened in the past week or so?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Is that an alternative to NATO? It's a security alliance, right?
Well, Shanghai, it's not really a military alliance. So it's more, in the realm of economic cooperation. So it's not in anything like NATO. I mean, NATO is a really very tight military alliance. I mean, it has a joint command control system. So everybody is subordinate to NATO, and there's nothing comparable, among the Russians or the Chinese or anyone else. So, and that hasn't happened yet. But I mean, there are obviously negotiations afoot between the Russians and the Chinese military, but it's still a long way from any kind of a formal military alliance.
Right.
But you're absolutely right in that it's clear that Washington is now quite anxious about the balance of power in the world tilting against it. And there's obviously some kind of a debate going on among the U.S. policy-making elite as to whom the United States should take on first. Should they take on Russia first, or should they take on China first? Now, Trump, I think, if we go back to the 2016 campaign, his view was that we should basically take on China first. China is the rising power. China is now, almost an economic equal to the United States. We should deal with them and try to get the Russians on board. But of course, if you want to get the Russians on board, you're going to have to make a lot of concessions to the Russians, and which neither Trump nor anyone in Washington is prepared to make. And of course, the much more of the foreign policy consensus, the kind of anti-Trump foreign policy consensus, is that the United States should take on Russia first. The Russia is the sort of is the weaker because it's not really it's not a strong economy like China, and there are it's surrounded by states that, for historic reasons, have a real animus towards Russia. So you've got the Baltic states and Poland, and now Ukraine, and that therefore Russia is the more vulnerable. And I think that seems to be the position that is prevailing in Washington. So Trump seems to have given up his promise in 2016 to improve relations with Russia, and he now seems to be going along with the Washington consensus, which is let's take on Russia, and if we can, deal with Russia, enfeeble it, break it up, destroy its economy, then I think China will be isolated, and China would be more likely to succumb to our wishes, to stop being an economic rival to us. So I think that seems to be the consensus that's formed in Washington.
Yeah, and I think even Brzezinski, I think like the last thing that he wrote before he died was he almost just reneged or just completely changed the views that he had been,
Mm-hmm.
that he had set out in his grand chessboard, and I guess it was all based on the Mackinder Heartland theory and all of that. And it seemed like he just completely reversed on that and decided that, I think he may have even, I shouldn't bring it up because I'm not sure of the specific recommendations that he made. The thing that I remember is just, how it was a complete turnaround from what he had set out for his whole life. But yeah, so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and all this panic, I guess what McGurk was doing there, and why I said it was the blame game, was that just like other things with the Bush and Obama administration, they're trying to, the Trump administration is a convenient scapegoat.
Yes.
It's easy to blame these things as if they all happened in the past 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. And I was glad to see that you called him out on that. Right. Another thing you mentioned in one of your recent tweets is that, we all know that NATO is right up on the Russian border and has been for some years. But you mentioned that NATO is right in the suburbs of St. Petersburg. I didn't realize quite how close.
Well, yes, I mean, yes, exactly. Because if you look at the map and you look at where the Baltic states are, I mean, they're right up against St. Petersburg. I mean, you're pretty much, once you're there, you are actually almost in the suburbs of St. Petersburg. And the Russians know this. I mean, so the notion that you've got a hostile military alliance that is just a few miles from the suburbs of St. Petersburg, and they are supposed to just sit still for this and accept NATO assurances. Oh, don't worry, we're not aggressive. We don't mean to wage war against anyone. Purely defensive alliance. Don't worry about anything. The Russians are supposed to accept these assurances when they've had any amount of evidence of aggressive NATO activity, particularly Yugoslavia, and this was against Serbia, which is still a very, very sore point for the Russians. I mean, because they basically, feel that they let down their little brother Serbia, and because they were just too weak to do anything about it. So that's a sore point for them. What NATO did in '99, and of course again what NATO did in Libya and NATO's involvement in other Middle East conflicts, such as in Syria. So the notion that the Russia should just simply accept assurances from NATO, from Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, oh, don't worry about anything, we're just purely defensive. It's laughable. I mean, what serious country is simply going to accept the public statements of rival adversary states?
Yeah, and military exercises on right next to Kaliningrad and things like that. I mean, who do we think we're kidding here?
Yes.
I was just going to ask you something else. Oh, yeah. A lot of people here misunderstand the relationship between Yugoslavia and USSR. Mm-hmm. Can you just real quick describe what that was?
Well, it was an interesting case because Yugoslavia had been during the wartime years, from about 1945 to 1948, they'd been very close relations, and then there was a dramatic deterioration in relations between Stalin and Tito. So much so that Yugoslavia really and the USSR really became very serious adversaries, and the United States rushed in and tried to fuel this enmity. And so from 1948 on, the United States was quite involved with Yugoslavia, trying to build up Yugoslavia as a rival to the USSR. After Stalin's death, the Soviet Union patched things up with Tito. But Yugoslavia never returned to the fold. It never became a part of NATO. It always maintained its sort of independence, its independent foreign policy, and its own independent social and economic system, the so-called market socialism that they cultivated. And Yugoslavia, played this to the hill because, of course, it enabled them to get quite a lot of Western assistance, while at the same time, they maintained reasonably good relations with the Soviet Union and the rest of the Eastern Bloc. And then Yugoslavia in 1955 at the Bandung Conference became one of the leaders of the non-aligned group of nations. I don't know if you remember that, along with Nasser and with Nehru and Sukarno. I mean, this became this sort of the non-aligned nation. So in other words, they weren't part of the Western Bloc, the Western NATO bloc, and they weren't also part of the Soviet Union Warsaw Pact bloc. So Yugoslavia was one of the leaders of this non-aligned movement. So at no time was Yugoslavia a part of the Soviet bloc, other than for a brief time just after World War II. But the rest of the time, relations were fraught, occasionally, reasonably friendly, but definitely Yugoslavia was not a part of the Soviet bloc, and did pursue an independent foreign policy, and often was very critical of Soviet foreign policy.
Yeah, but they never had any formal commitment to the USSR. They were never part of the pact, right?
No, never. Right. Never that. I mean, the Warsaw Pact only came into being in the 1950s, already some years late after NATO, which very few people know about. That NATO came first, and the 1949 Warsaw Pact didn't come into existence until 1955. So the Warsaw Pact was a response to NATO, but certainly Yugoslavia was never a member of that and had no relationship whatever to the Warsaw Pact.
Now, another question that I had about back to Russia and China. In a previous conversation, I had just always thought, and I think this is very simplistic, and in fact, it's funny because I saw another, let me see, I think I have this noted here. Yeah, there was a Washington Times article that you commented on, and it's titled, "Putin is getting played by China and needs a deal with Trump." Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of it is that, China fleeced the United States and now it's going to do the same thing to Russia.
Yes.
And a quote from it is, quote, "China used America's desire to defeat the Soviet Union to acquire everything it needed from America while secretly plotting to defeat the United States for world dominance. So, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, you knocked that one down a little. Well, you actually just kind of mocked it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's. I mean, the whole idea that this persuading the Russians, hey, well, you got to, you got to watch the Chinese. Watch your back with the Chinese. Better be friends with us. We're much better friends to you than the Chinese. I mean, when you think of everything the United States has done to Russia, I mean, we've already talked about the NATO expansion, but what it's now doing, which is essentially arming Ukraine and egging on Ukraine into a military confrontation with Russia. The notion that the Russians are going to abandon their, economic partner and throw their lot in with the Americans, whom they, who've already shown their kind of treachery. It's just laughable. I mean, it just isn't going to happen. I mean, the Russians aren't stupid. They're not going to make the same mistake that they made in the early 90s, when they just blindly accepted American assurances and American commitments to drive the economy, the Russian economy, into a complete free fall. It's just not going to happen. I mean, there's going to be no return to 1990 and the whole sort of Boris Yeltsin and that era. That's gone. And again, it shows the delusional nature of the Americans to think that somehow we can go back to that time. We can, Putin will be gone, and we'll have some ludicrous figure like Boris Yeltsin, and once again, U.S. corporations can move in and buy up, Russia's natural resources for, so on. I mean, that isn't going to happen.
Yeah. There seems to be a generation, or a faction, or a generation of people here, and someone like Bill Browder comes to mind,
right?
Who, can't accept that the grand plan for Russia, has not worked out the way it was supposed to, especially since it seemed like they were going to succeed, right? Mm-hmm. And just sort of co-opting Russia, taking over everything, including all of their financial resources, their companies' resources. Mm-hmm. And Russia was able to pull back. Yes. And, that's all because of Putin, according to people who want to boil it all down to one man who controls everything and all of the largest country in the world, Russia.
Well, that's true. And of course, there are historical parallels to this. I mean, that Russia does go through these odd phases in which it embraces unquestioningly the West. And then when that turns, after they do that, of course, the West turns around and completely, betrays them and does them in. Then there's a reaction against it, and you saw that particularly in World War I, when Russia was really pushed into going to war, when for no reason other than to help out France. Of course, it was a calamity. As everyone in Russia should have known that a war with Germany would be a calamity for Russia, and of course there was a reaction set in after that, and then we saw this scenario replayed in the late 80s and early 90s, when suddenly this Russian elite, some of whom were communists. I mean, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, these were all former communists, suddenly embraced Western free market philosophy. And of course, again, led their country to absolute catastrophe. So, there's and obviously it led to the reaction against that. And Western policymakers are kind of hoping, that Putin can't go on forever, and after Putin's gone, there'll be some Gorbachev, Yeltsin-like figure, and we'll be back to the good old days. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't, something like that isn't going to happen anytime soon. But I'm sure that, policymakers are dreaming of the return of Gorbachev, Yeltsin.
Yeah, well, I think they've now, first you had Joe Biden going over and telling, I believe he did this, when Medvedev became president and he and Putin switched places, right, because legally Putin couldn't serve, contiguous terms, but he could serve more terms if he stepped out for a little bit.
Yes.
And Joe Biden, I believe, met with Putin and told him, you can't be president again.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
He did that? Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes.
But now Putin says after 2024 or 2025, he's really retiring, right?
Well, I think it's more a matter of age. I mean, I think that no one goes on forever. So, I mean, he's just figuring, well, will I be physically up to it? Because if they do another switch with Medvedev or whoever, then he has to do that for I think 6 years, and then comes back again. That's he's going to be pretty old by then. So. But it's not impossible. I mean, who knows? I mean, because we don't know whether there's some figure that somebody he's cultivating right now as his heir apparent, his successor. If there isn't anyone like that, then who knows? Maybe he will just go on into his 90s. I mean,
Yeah.
stranger things have happened. Other leaders have done that.
At least as an advising elder or something like
Right.
that.
Yes.
Yeah. But so the people who sort of raided Russia in the 90s, and then, there was some blowback on them in the mid 2000s and since then. They seem to have recalibrated and said, all right, well, we're going to have to wait until Putin retires. But they don't seem to have given up the goal of regime changing Russia and breaking it up, and like corporate raiders, but, on a national, international scale.
That's right.
So
if you follow the tweets of the former ambassador, Obama's ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, that's his theme again and again. He comes back to that. Well, Putin's not going to go on forever. We shouldn't assume that Russia will be like this forever. Things will change. So it's very much he's holding out the hope. Putin will be gone, and we're going to get someone who's going to basically let us come in and loot the place all over again. So that's McFaul, and there are other people who are putting that kind of nonsense out.
Yeah, I don't know why they have so much power and influence, but according to like Dr. Stephen Cohen talks about this a lot. He can go back to I think the 50s whenever, and I can look at Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick did that Untold History of the United States, and they describe Roosevelt and his vice president his name's gonna escape
Henry
me.
Wallace.
Yeah, of course, Henry Wallace, and the choices they had after World War II, how we could have become, I mean, not an ally, but not an enemy with the Soviet Union. Like that was an option.
Yes.
And there were forces who came to power with Truman, or sort of got more power under Truman, who, and of course Churchill and the UK plays a big role in this too, from my understanding, that, they just were like, that is not going to happen. And what the underlying things are, I'm not quite sure. Some of it is just an enmity. In some cases, it seems to be people who have roots in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And, for good reason, resent the Soviet Union, and they still think of Russia as the Soviet Union. But Cohen talks about numerous cases where American presidents had decided to try to pursue that rapprochement and what we don't know, whatever kind of alliance they intended. But people went to great lengths to undermine that and to sabotage that. Yes. And then we just saw it again. I don't know exactly how these factions line up or who are the strongest powers in them, but we just saw it again with Trump. And this time, I mean, they really turned the country upside down to prevent that from happening.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think it should not be. I mean, it's not fashionable to say so, but it's there's no question that you can explain Watergate in part as the rebellion by the deep state, the military security establishment, to bring Nixon to an end. I mean, they really did not like the Nixon detente policy. And he succeeded in doing so, because once Nixon was gone, detente, unraveled pretty quickly. So that, there is a long tradition of that. And you're absolutely right. In the case of Trump, I mean, I mean, you don't have to do any conspiracy mongering. There they are. They're the people who have been sabotaging the policy. Comey, Brennan, Clapper, the three people who ran the security services under Obama. They're the ones who created Russiagate, and they're the ones who are absolutely rabid about Russia, and turned perfectly innocuous diplomatic exchanges between Trump and Putin into acts of treachery. He was treasonous in talking in a friendly way with Putin in Helsinki last year. I mean, this is absolutely insane, and it's been a total disaster, not just for the United States and Russia, but for the rest of the world. I mean, relations are now so bad that you could have anything could escalate into a serious military confrontation. I mean, you saw yesterday in the New York, I think it was yesterday, a couple of days ago in the New York Times, the article about how the Americans now got into the Russians' electric grid. Obviously, we don't know that that's true. We don't know whether that's bluster or if they actually have done that. But next time there's two planes crash into each other because something went wrong with the air traffic control in Moscow, or next time some hydroelectric plant in Russia collapses and there's mass flooding, how are the Russians going to respond? I mean, they're going to say, this could well have been sabotaged by the United States, and they will respond. I mean, that's going to be. And then, is this what we want? Lights out in New York City, people dying in hospitals and airliners crashing into one another at JFK. I mean, this is just nuts. Where this obsession with Russia has gone. And remember, it was actually said in that interview. They were quoted Bolton, Trump's national security advisor, who says that, well, this is a perfectly appropriate response to their, quote, election meddling, unquote, for which, again, we don't have any proof. But even if it were true, even if what Bolton said were true, and that it was the Russians who hacked the DNC server and got into John Podesta's emails, even if that were true, how on earth is getting into an electric grid in any way a proportionate response to that? I mean, it's just borders on complete insanity.
Yeah, it really does. And I can't quite understand where exactly this is coming from. Who thinks that the level of risk that they're throwing into this is possibly justified, or that it's in any way fair or legal to put their own, Americans under that kind of threat.
Yes.
We notoriously have a crumbling infrastructure.
Yes.
And we also notoriously, in our cyber operations, at the military level, seem to focus mostly on playing offense, on attacks, and not so much on defense. And that article was really frightening for a number of reasons. But note what they also did in that, and maybe that's what you're referring to at the beginning, was they threw in a paragraph there saying that, anonymous sourced intelligence people told them that they haven't really told Trump about this because they're afraid of his reaction.
Yes.
And they're afraid that he may tell the Russians about it. So basically, as I was saying, in between the lines, it's just another treason accusation.
Right.
That he's treasonous or always potentially treasonous.
Right.
So I mean,
Right.
when I first saw that article, I thought, all right, this is saber rattling at Russia because Russia is helping Syria get Idlib back,
Hmm.
and because Russia is allied with Iran, and we're in a real pickle right now with Iran, and so we have to lash out at Russia because
Hmm.
Russia's to blame for everything, of course. But it, it
Yeah.
was it was just a stunning article,
Yeah.
just
It
stunning.
yeah, it's like, and what you just quoted, that that somehow saying, well, that these Pentagon people did not tell the president because, as you say, they were afraid that he might tell the Russians about it, or he might bring this program to an end. I mean, if you think, if that's true, then these people are engaged in a coup. I mean, that this this really is treason. I mean, this really does bring to mind the events in that the great film from the 1960s. I don't know whether you saw it, 7 Days in May, where you had that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs just simply ignoring the president. He's just pursuing his own policy. I mean, this kind of stuff is, you know, it's you don't just fire people like this. I mean, you should be arresting them and putting them on trial that they're engaging in a major foreign and military policy without consulting the the civilian democratically elected people to whom they're supposedly answered.
And then at the same time, George, you have some of these big figures who were at the root of Russiagate, and
Mhm.
if it was a soft coup against Trump, like
Right.
Comey,
Hmm.
Brennan, and Clapper, you have them all over television, saying that's ridiculous. What are you talking? This isn't a coup, or But then at the same time, you have um, that anonymous op-ed in the New York Times, the infamous anonymous op-ed
Hmm.
from supposedly someone inside the Trump administration,
Hmm.
basically saying, "Oh, they said, we're not the deep state, we're the steady state." So in other words, saying, "Yeah, there's a deep state here, and we're performing a coup." I mean, how else can you put that?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean,
It's gaslighting.
yeah,
It's
and it's stunning that the media think that this is fine. They actually think this is great that you've got people in the Pentagon or in the CIA who apparently just pursue their own policy. They're not answerable to the president. In fact, any interference by the president in whatever they're doing is somehow reprehensible. No, we're just doing whatever we're doing. Who the hell is Trump to tell us what to do? I mean, and this is the media saying this. I mean, that they think this is fine, that the security services should just do whatever they feel like doing and recklessly push the country into what could be a very serious crisis and confrontation with a rival nuclear power, all unsupervised by elected political leaders. I
yeah.
mean, this, this the insanity here is just extraordinary. And no one in the media just seems to think that there's something really needs to be done. I mean, because you really cannot have it. I mean, this is even in the Soviet Union, the worst times of the Soviet Union, you really didn't have sort of KGB just sort of, well, we're just going to pursue our own policy, and we really don't care what our civilian superiors want. We're just if we're going to provoke a war with the United States, well, we'll just provoke a war. Who are the civilian leaders to tell us? I mean, this is. I mean, if it's true, if what it's saying is true, and it's certainly consistent with everything else that we've heard about the actions of the deep state, people who are currently employed within the government and their attitude towards Trump. So it's certainly consistent with that. Then it is a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, and I don't even know whether it necessarily has to be technically within the government anymore. For example, our intelligence budget. First of all, we don't really even know what that. No, we know it's tens of billions, or
Right.
we don't really even know.
No.
But what we do know is that about 70% of that is goes to third parties, as
Mm-hmm.
contractors.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not even quite sure whether a person has to be technically employed by the government or within the government to participate in this kind of thing. I'm pretty
Yes.
sure that we've got so many contractors and
Yes.
mercenaries now that it's really kind of muddied the waters.
Right, right. Yes, no, exactly. I mean, that's I mean, you've got this character. I mean, there's a lot of characters like that, but I mean, the one that comes to mind is Christopher Steele, who was getting money from the U.S. government. So he's getting money from the U.S. government to interfere in an election, smear a presidential candidate, and it's all on the public dime. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, and he has access to the highest levels of the government, putting out this complete and utter nonsense with like his dossier. I mean, as you say, so I mean, and there's other people who are doing this kind of stuff. This, like these independent contractors, and we know quite a lot now about how these independent contractors have access to the most secret of data. I mean, all the stuff that the NSA collects about communications by Americans. So we have these contractors like Fusion GPS or CrowdStrike have access to this data. So it's not just, oh, well, only the NSA sees it. No, lots of other people get to see these data as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact details on Russiagate. Russiagate is a rabbit hole, maybe like no other. So it's hard to remember all the details without my notes and my timeline in front of me. But one of the stories is that the head of the NSA, Admiral Rogers, not the Congressman Mike Rogers, the Admiral Mike Rogers,
the good guy, or the relatively the good guy, as opposed to the Congressman who's not a good guy.
The better one, that he discovered that maybe it was Brennan's interagency task force had contractors, or that somebody had some contractors had access to these databases, and they were the unmasking scandal was really going on there, and that he shut that down.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. That's what I've read as well. That he actually had a secret meeting with Trump, warning him about this, and I think he also warned Trump that he was being spied on by the U.S. government. So he just warned himself, be careful what the U.S. government is up to. They're actually spying on you. So he actually flew to New York to warn Trump. This was immediately after the election. And so, but as you say, I mean, it is very murky. I mean, how the origins of Russiagate, because we've got these strands. We've got the Hillary Clinton who hires Fusion GPS, who in turn hires this figure who is retired MI6, but of course nobody ever retires from MI6. You continue to be a member of MI6, so a retired MI6 person to come up with this dossier, which is full of nonsense. But somehow then he's also working together with the FBI. So you got this, they're working in tandem. So it's not just opposition research, because this is actually within the portals of the FBI. So the FBI itself is engaged in opposition research. And that's a serious business, because then the FBI is actually involved in an election, which, and without any means, any basis for it, other than it just basically it didn't want Trump. I mean, it clearly saw Trump as in at least 2016 as a threat to U.S. security, U.S. interests, whatever they saw. But they clearly saw Trump as someone who had to be stopped.
Yeah, he couldn't be trusted. He was unsatisfactory leader of the empire. He wasn't going to be able to pull off the kind of finesse that you need to do that. But speaking of that, before we wrap up, the other bit of information that came out just recently through Roger Stone's court case, which is getting more bizarre by the minute, we just found out that the FBI, not only did they not have access to the DNC's various servers, they relied on CrowdStrike, who had been hired by the DNC, actually.
Yes.
And the DNC, so the FBI and James Comey told Congress this, that we relied on their forensic analysis.
Yes.
And we just found out that even the FBI didn't get the full CrowdStrike analysis and report. They got a redacted
That's right.
CrowdStrike report.
Yes.
Well, who redacted that, first off? Who decided that the FBI didn't have enough authority to...
Right.
I mean, what
Yes.
the heck is that about?
Exactly. So that's right. So in other words, all of these claims, oh, Russia hacked this, Russia hacked that, comes from CrowdStrike. The FBI unquestioningly accepted this. And when CrowdStrike said, we're not going to give you our servers, you can't conduct any kind of investigation of it, we'll just show you our report about our servers. And the FBI just said, yeah, that's fine, we'll go along with that. Then it turns out from this that it's the redacted, they worked with a redacted version. And remember, all of these claims, all of this we've accepted, or at least the media have accepted about what the Russians did in this election, is based on this. This is all on this nonsense of this CrowdStrike report. So it's CrowdStrike report, and the other source is, of course, the Steele dossier. So you imagine this hysteria that we've been inundated with, which is that Russians interfered with our election. And the Mueller report is filled with this nonsense. And it's based on these extraordinarily idiotic sources. We got the Steele dossier and then the CrowdStrike report, which is redacted. And we just simply, accept as if this is an impartial, serious forensic inquiry, when, of course, we know that the people who run CrowdStrike are really part of the national security apparatus. I mean, the guy who was the founder of it is a member of the Atlantic Council. So completely unreliant. But all the rest about how, the Russians hacked it and then passed it on to Julian Assange, no basis for this whatsoever. And so we're going through all this, when John Bolton says, oh, well, we have to do this in response to the Russian election interference. And this is your evidence. I mean, it's a joke and really quite scary that, you're ready to go to this, to these limits on the basis of such flimsy evidence.
Yeah, the whole, narrative that Russia hacked our elections and broadly interfered, a sweeping, some words in the very beginning of the Mueller report.
Yes.
That is the most important narrative that must survive. Even if other parts of Russiagate collapses, that must survive.
That's right.
And
that's it.
Yeah, I could go into more.
Just to confirm, to second what you just said, and the evidence that the Mueller was determined to retain that narrative is that he did no investigation. He didn't look into anything that might call that interpretation into question. And so it's like, imagine if there's a police inquiry that they decide who the murderer is, and they don't even bother to look into any other possible theory, any other possible suspects. They just decide ahead of time who it is. So Mueller relies on this CrowdStrike report. He doesn't go and talk to Julian Assange. If ever there's a person in this world who would give an answer to the question, where did this stuff come from? In the emails, the DNC emails and the Podesta emails, is Julian Assange. And Julian Assange had made clear that he is ready to talk to Mueller and ready to provide him with information. Yet Mueller didn't go and talk to him. I mean, it just shows what an absurd kind of investigation it was. I mean, they spent I don't know how many, 35, 40 million, probably even more than that, built up this fat cat legal team. I mean, what the hell did they do for 2 years? I mean, they obviously did no serious investigation.
Yeah, well, I could speculate on what they did for 2 years. I mean, they tried to get somebody to, bolster their narrative because it is so flimsy. Exactly. It is so, and they also, for whatever reason, Julian Assange is, he has been incommunicado for a little more than a year now, he was completely shut down.
That's
You
right.
know what else is interesting? Someone on Twitter brought this up. Um, they went back to an archive of Julian Assange's tweets from around March 2018 when his internet was cut off.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember thinking at the time, the Catalonia,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that did cause problems for Ecuador, and maybe it, convinced Ecuador to move on him where they wouldn't before. But I just always thought that wasn't a sufficient explanation for why they went to such great lengths to shut him down.
Right.
And so I remember going through his tweets at the time and thinking, well, what was he into? What was he about to do? What was he talking about? Why did they have to shut him down? But I don't remember finding anything that seemed conclusive to me. But someone just put out some tweets from March 2018 of what Assange was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and he was talking about Mifsud and
Yes.
Downer
Yes.
and
Mm-hmm.
this kind of thing. He was, refuting that they were some kind of, Russian agent or whatever the narrative was at the
Yes.
time.
That's right.
So I find that interesting. But, Julian Assange could melt down Russiagate if
That's
he
right.
provided that evidence, right?
Exactly. So that's why the last thing that Mueller, the FBI, or anybody wanted to do was to go talk to him. You keep talking about Russia did this, Russia did that. Talk to the man who knows about what Russia did or didn't do. Oh, well, that's the last thing we want. Because that might cause our theories to be thrown out of the window. So we're not going to talk to him, and we're going to make sure that he doesn't talk to anyone. We're going to cut off his communications.
Yeah. It's not like they couldn't find him.
That
Uh,
right.
it's
So yes,
Yeah, it's not like he wasn't willing to talk to
exactly.
somebody. He was working on an immunity deal
That's right.
that James Comey and
That,
Mark Warner
that's right. Sabbath.
sabotaged.
That's right. That's exactly right. So we just all goes to show that there was never any attempt to get to the bottom of Russiagate. Russiagate was just much too useful as a political tool, so they can just be continually deployed as it still is. It's already been was it a couple of months since Mueller issued his so-called report, and it's like nothing has changed. We're still talking about Russia. Russia did this. Russia did that. They attacked our election and so on. So the story has been retained. No one must challenge the story. And then of course when Mueller made his one public appearance, that was his main message. Look what Russia did to us. We need to address that. That was his message to the American people.
Right. And I think I know one of the reasons why it's so important for that narrative to survive. There are converging interests in this, right? There are a number of different
Mm-hmm.
groups of people who benefit from this, who rely on this. But I think one of them is, and I think Andrew McCarthy has sort of made that clear inadvertently or whatever. And James Comey certainly has, and other people who are defending, actually, even some people on like the Fox News set, what they're saying is that um, what Brennan and Clapper and Comey did was bad, and there should be accountability and all this, but they didn't spy on the president. They had reason. There was a basis. They
Mm-hmm.
had reason to worry that Trump was, colluding with the Russians,
Mm-hmm.
and the Russians were attacking our election.
Mm-hmm.
So, the whole big effort that they made um, can't be found to be treasonous or seditious
Yes.
because there was a base, and
Yes.
it protects the highest level intelligence people in the country who apparently their survival and their well-being is more important than the well-being of the country or the world for that matter,
Yes.
and it's the top priority.
Right. No, I think that's a very good explanation, because that becomes their defense. Well, yeah, maybe we went a little far, but look what the Russians were doing. Look what the situation was. We had to do something, and we made some mistakes, and that will probably be the thrust of the DOJ report, the one that Barr has commissioned, and probably will be the Inspector General. That will be the thrust of the Inspector General report. Well, the Russians doing terrible things, but so the U.S. government had to do something, had to respond in some way. So maybe maybe it went a little far, but we had to do something about the Russians. So I think that's a good explanation. Another explanation, I think, is that for those who are interested in whipping up anti-Russian fervor, it's hard to make the case as to why are we supposed to hate the Russians so much? Why are we supposed to be on the brink of going to war with Russia? What have the Russians done? So before 2016, the Russophobes, these neoconservatives, there's the Max Boots and others, they kept talking about Ukraine or Crimea or Georgia. The case was very weak because for Americans, they look at it and say, well, what's Ukraine to us? I mean, it's close to Russia. It's they're all Russian speakers, and Crimea, as far as Americans are concerned, they'd always assumed that Crimea was part of Russia. So the case was never very convincing that Russia was a threat. So you had to come up with a theory as to in what way is Russia a threat. And I think this so-called cyber attack or their attack on our election provides this casus belli that, well, look what the Russians did. They attacked us. This was an act of aggression on the Russia's part. Therefore, we need to do something about them. So I think that what 2016 enabled them to do is to come up with a sort of a rationale for this prevailing Russophobia and the need to continually militarize our foreign policy toward Russia.
Right. And that's the part of this converging interesting. Why Russiagate is such a huge deal, because, you have NATO and, it's being questioned. Why do we even need this? So their survival,
That's right.
is on the line.
Right.
And you have our military who very much want to pivot from fighting, insurgent wars in the Middle East to they want the glory days of a near peer adversary again. They're all just talking about this all the time. They're loving it.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, and that goes along with what you...
That's right. And when you say about NATO, so NATO, which talks about a Russian threat, and so somebody might look at it and say, well, who's under threat? Is Russia about to invade Poland? I mean, how? I mean, who exactly is Russia threatening? But look, they are waging this cyber war. They are waging this propaganda war. They're trying to undermine our system. It's all everywhere where you don't see it. Somewhere invisible in cyberspace. The Russians are everywhere. Russian bots are everywhere. Russians are trying to undermine political parties. They're trying to stage coups. Everything is being destroyed and messed with by the Russians, and that's a NATO propaganda line. So you think, well, I thought everything was peaceful. No, Russians are everywhere. So yeah, this is all part of this this propaganda exercise.
Yeah, and then of course there's the vaunted Queen Hillary, who needs that narrative to cover up some of her own stuff and ultimately to explain why she suffered the most catastrophic electoral loss maybe in American history.
Right. The Hillary and of course the rest of the Democrats, who have now persuaded themselves that somehow they lost, not because they ran the worst campaign in history and they nominated a candidate who everybody knew in 2016 was just a completely hopeless candidate. They, rather than face any of that, let's just blame everything on the Russians. I mean, it's like, oh, well, that's why we lost. And that's now become a kind of almost conventional wisdom. I mean, you read an editorial in the New York Times. I mean, they just take it as something beyond question that the 2016 election was decided by the Russians. That's it. That's it. Hillary Clinton lost because of the Russians. No evidence needed. It's just become kind of the working assumption of that kind of the liberal DNC elite.
Yeah. All right. Well, we should probably let you go, George. If you would, tell people where to find your work or how to support you or, how to contact you, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look on my Twitter feed, Twitter, I think is probably the best way to reach me. You can direct message me on Twitter. There's just my name is George Szamuely, and then my writings sort of appear in a variety of places and Counterpunch and so on. So, but probably if people want to reach me, then Twitter is the best way to go.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you so much for your time. And
I enjoyed it enormously.
yes, that's great. And let's get back together at some point to talk about Yugoslavia because,
Yes.
boy, I have a lot to learn about that, and I think I'm not alone on
Yeah,
that.
that's an interesting topic. Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, much neglected, and people have sort of forgotten about. Which is the antecedent event of sort of the American aggressive imperialism after 9/11. So, but before all of that came Yugoslavia. That kind of laid the groundwork for everything that came subsequently. So it's very much worth talking about.
Right, much more important than I ever realized. So again, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Good, look forward to it.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to George Szamuely. Follow George at George Szamuely, Szamuely, and read his book, Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. Around the Empire is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Special thanks to patrons and other contributors who support this show. It makes a big difference to me. It covers the costs of hosting and distribution with a little bit left over for other expenses, which means that this is still mainly a labor of love. So on a side note, as far as I know, nobody gets rich as an anti-interventionist content creator. Marketing and fundraising is obviously not a talent of mine, so I'm considering launching a separate fundraising campaign to help me with the kinds of improvements and expansion into video content that I'd like to do. I really do loathe doing that, but it looks like it's going to be a necessity, so you'll see that coming hopefully this summer. And what you can do right now is I need to increase the number of patrons on Patreon, and you can do the one-time contributions at PayPal. So, there are many ways to listen to this podcast. Find it, subscribe on your favorite mobile podcast app, or listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like that video. Leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.